Afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's panel discussion on technology and elections during a pandemic. The event is sponsored by Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy. My name is Ed Felten. I'm the Robert E. Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment, but first let me lay a little groundwork for the discussion we're going to have. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously has affected every aspect of our lives. Here at Princeton, we've sent our students home, we've moved our courses and research online, and like most Americans, we're currently under a shelter-in-place directive here in New Jersey. But our topic today is how this is going to specifically affect upcoming elections and how officials and voters can respond. Some states have primary elections coming up soon. For those primaries, for these primaries, many voters, perhaps all in some places, will be unable to vote in person. Some states might end up postponing their primaries, as West Virginia has done. Others will go ahead as scheduled. It's difficult to predict where we're going to be in November in terms of the pandemic, but in-person voting might still be too dangerous. And even if most people are free to move around to go to the polling place by then, many voters may be unable or unwilling to vote in person. So states and localities will need to be ready to accept votes by mail from all of their voters if need be. Online voting now still is too dangerous and too risky to be practical anytime soon. So if people can't vote in person, then vote by mail or vote at home, dropping off the ballot safely at a collection point or some similar arrangement seems like the only option. We'll talk later about the challenges involved in scaling up vote by mail. But of course, elections are not just about voting. They're also about how candidates and others reach out to voters and try to influence the electorate. By disrupting lives, by preventing in-person gatherings or door-to-door canvassing, and even just by changing media consumption patterns, the pandemic will profoundly change how campaigns operate and change the issues that officials and people directing campaigns have to deal with. And we'll talk about that as well. But let me now introduce the panelists. I'll go in alphabetical order. Dana Chisnell currently teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School on topics such as design in government. She's a leading thinker and doer on design and human factors in elections. She's worked with NIST on election standards, with the AARP on plain language and usability, and with numerous state and local election officials. Welcome, Dana. Jared DeMarinis is Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance for the Maryland State Board of Elections. His main duties there include the implementation of electoral policy and the interpretation of state candidacy and campaign finance laws and regulations. And Ellen Weintraub is a commissioner at the Federal Election Commission. She's served as an FEC commissioner since 2002 and has been chair of the commission 3 times. And she's been an important voice on campaign finance issues and on the impact of technology on campaigns. Thank you to all 3 of us for appearing with us today. We're really lucky to have you here.
Thank you.
To get started, I'd like to turn to Jared DeMarinis. You're an election official in Maryland, and Maryland is scheduled to have a primary election that's coming up on June 2nd. So what are the challenges that you see as the scheduled date is approaching?
So we were one of the elections that was postponed. It was scheduled for April 28th and has now subsequently been moved back to June 2nd. Some of the challenges now, of course, is just the health challenges that are facing everyone and the lack of election judges that would facilitate in-person voting. Election judges are 50% of our election judges are over the age of 60. So there are a high at-risk population there and of taking the shelter-in-place warnings very seriously, as well as everyone else. So there's the challenges of then making sure we have enough people if we have to go through a regular election at the time. As a state who doesn't do a vote by mail program, but just has no excuse absentee ballots, when you move to that, which we're doing for a special general election on April 28th, and most likely the June 2nd is going to be a vote by mail situation here. you have to ramp up your entire absentee ballot program and making sure that it's out there correctly. Additionally, you have to deal with candidates and their issues that are being affected by this as well, because now they need to know how the program is going to be run, what they can do for campaigning, since there's a lack of campaigning now. Additionally, you have the where their role comes into it, which is making sure that they can have access to view the ballots prior to their canvass, the ability to challenge ballots, while at the same time doing it in facilities that are not necessarily equipped to handle people with the normal 6 feet, 2 meter distance from each other. And so you have to look at new technologies on how to make sure that they can have access and not challenge or control the secrecy of the ballot as well. So these are just kind of some of the challenges that we're facing right now as we're gearing towards a crash course in a vote-by-mail program. So.
Great, thanks. Do any other panelists want to weigh in on that question before I turn to you two with other questions? Ellen, you may be muted.
You're right. I was. Sorry. Question for Jared. Are you
Sure.
going to have the resources that you need to ramp up and do this expanded vote-by-mail program?
Well, hopefully we're getting some more federal dollars on that aspect there. I mean, this is an emergency here, so the state government did allow for more COVID-19 resources to be used. Since this is such a constitutional right and making sure about it, this is one of those things where it's almost a national emergency type of priority. Get the job done. Hopefully the money will come eventually. One of the bigger things too, which is the hit that the local jurisdictions, the counties particularly, didn't really budget for, was the vote by mail program, because it's now prepaid postage, and that we were going to do it for absentee ballots, and with a 6% turnout normally for absentee ballots, that's a budget hit that they budgeted for correctly. Now, when you're looking at, in the June election, over 3.5 million registered, party voters, and possibly even going into the November election with another, for 4 million registered voters plus. These are hits that the counties in particular are not budgeting for. So yes, I think we need some aspects of money, and the other thing too is just resources are problematic, especially with the idea of election judges. No matter what, you're still going to need bodies to help do these canvasses, and whether we kind of suspend or even just kind of alter them a little bit to make sure that the process is still transparent enough is key to this. And this is where we have to constantly look at new technologies or new ways to get the job done.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to Dana Chisnell. Dana, you've worked for years to make elections more accessible, less error-prone, and more intuitive for everybody. What challenges do you see if a lot more people have to suddenly move to absentee or vote-by-mail type of situation?
Well, thank you, Ed, for inviting me. And I have so many questions about the administration part of this, but for voters specifically, the thing that we've seen historically is that the error rate is much higher for vote at home ballots, because people make mistakes or they change their mind and they mark the ballot in a way that is hard to interpret intent. Some states don't have good documentation about what counts as intent when you're reviewing ballots as they're being counted and tallied. So there's an advantage to voting at the polls in that you have two stopgaps from losing votes. One is there are poll workers who you can say, I think I made a mistake. I would like to replace my ballot and get a new one. And you can mark that and cast that. Or you could possibly get all the way to a precinct tally scanner, and it might not be able to read your ballot because you mismarked it somehow, or you overvoted, and it will reject it, so you can void it and get a new ballot. So those are two major things that I see. In vote by mail states that have had it for a long time, there are procedures for getting a new ballot if you make a mistake. And voters have been trained over years how to manage that process. You also get your ballot quite a bit ahead of time, 45 to 30 days ahead of election day, giving lots of opportunities for a replacement ballot if you need one. But people who are new to vote by mail may not even realize that those are options.
Sure, great. So you talked about voter errors. Just so people who are less familiar with this get an idea, how common are errors? What might be a general ballpark error rate in a situation like this? It's an unfair question, but just so people get an idea, is it like 1%
Thank you for acknowledging
or 10%?
that.
Yeah.
There's so many factors involved, right? Like,
sure.
How many contests are on the ballot? Where are the contests on the ballot? And any number of other issues like what the target is for marking the ballot. So one of the things that we've seen is on ballots where the target is two ends of an arrow that you're supposed to connect, is definitely a place that is error prone. I would like to meet the person who came up with that design. If anybody knows them, I would just be curious about how they got to that instead of a bubble or a box to fill in. So if you just look at undervoted or overvoted contests, a typical kind of error rate of lost votes is under 1%. But when you see ballot design errors or lots of vote by mail, that number can go up, and the combination can also contribute quite a bit to lost votes.
Thanks. Any questions on this topic or questions for Dana from the panelists? Okay, so let me move on to Commissioner Ellen Weintraub. I'd like to ask you about what this will mean for campaign finance and campaign practices. What challenges do you see in making sure that the campaigns are open and fair?
Thanks, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Obviously, this is going to have a huge impact on the way campaigns are run. People won't be able to go out and hold rallies or knock on doors or hold in-person fundraisers or any of the things that they normally do. Fundraising is going to move really entirely online, and that's going to work better for some candidates than for others. Some people have a better digital game than others. Another risk with that is that we have seen, even before all of this, an increase in what we call scam PACs, PACs that purport to be raising money on behalf of candidates or sometimes even charities, but in fact they are set up by individuals who end up funneling all the money through consultants or fundraising groups that they are principals of, such that it all ends up back in their own pockets. So I think that consumers and voters are going to have to be particularly careful right now as they are trying to support their favorite candidates to make sure that the money is going where they want it to go. Related to that is the big issue of disinformation. Obviously an issue that has been out there for a long time before this. It was something that we had a problem with in the 2016 election coming from abroad, and that our intelligence community has already warned us. They were, even before the pandemic. They were anticipating foreign intervention in our elections. I don't know, maybe now everybody around the globe is too busy fighting the pandemic to be trying to muck around in other people's elections, but I'm not entirely sanguine on that point. So I think that people are going to have to be particularly careful about the information that they are consuming, because when we are all at home and we don't have the opportunity to gather around the water cooler at work and mingle on the streets with our friends and exchange ideas in those fora about what we've been hearing about, there are fewer opportunities for people to vet the information that they're getting, to engage in counter speech, to correct people when they hear that somebody is getting false information. So we are now living more or less in our filter bubbles, and that may not be the best way for us to get information about the election. And that is just, that doesn't even get to the issue of actual disinformation about the election process itself. Information that might pivot off of pandemic-related information to say, because of the pandemic, the election has now been moved, canceled. Some people are voting on Wednesday, other people are voting on Tuesday. There are a lot of dirty tricks out there that have been, going on since time immemorial that people may become more susceptible to in this environment.
Any comments from the other panelists on disinformation, what the response has been, is likely to be?
Well, I'd like to make a couple of points too, not on just disinformation, but also on the first part, which was about adjusting campaign strategies there. Yes. On the online fundraising. It's easier for the federal candidates, but as you get lower down the ballot, most of those candidates at the local and municipal levels really rely on fundraising that, those low dollar events, in person at local restaurants. This is making it almost impossible for them to fundraise because they don't have the bandwidth to do it. And I've kind of seen it where even like a big city like Baltimore in their mayoral race is having, difficulty getting those types of fundraising events and generating buzz about their campaigns now, due to the fact that they're not being out on the streets, and it's a completely different campaign through social media or signs or anything. So it's definitely having a harder impact on the smaller low dollar campaigns. Additionally, it's also affecting the third party candidates, because they're having difficulties now getting the signatures to get on the ballots through petitions. And we're having to deal with that with two political parties trying to get on our ballot, saying, can you lower the requirements like in New York and in Virginia, or even go to digital signatures on that front. But lastly, on the disinformation that Ellen brought up, which is probably the biggest part here, and it was an issue prior to COVID-19, and it's become even more paramount. Social media is now the escape more than ever from getting away from those news. And I think more and more people are just going on Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds, just because they're just sick and tired of looking at and seeing a chart of how many new cases and everything else. And so their impressions of what they're getting to see now is even more so. The use of bots and the spread of that information is going to be really of a key paramount to address in that front there. And additionally, any of those political ads and online, I would say issue advocacy as well, if they're not with, some disclaimers with it, showing who's behind it and who's the speaker and how they're trying to target you, it's doing a disservice to the electorate, because the fact that they're not getting the full picture, and they can't get that full picture now because they're not talking to anybody outside of that. They're just getting that impression every so often, and they're on these things nonstop, constantly.
If I can expand on that a bit. One of the things that we've seen over the last few years is some improvements in state election websites that are meant to be voter facing. Thank goodness. There are a bunch of guidelines out there in the world now that came from my previous employer, the Center for Civic Design, and they're excellent, of course. But the National Association of State Election Directors and the National Association of Secretaries of State have banded together for a social media campaign that's a hashtag #TrustedInfo2020. And if the audience here does nothing more than elevate that hashtag and constantly send people to their county and state election websites, that will be incredibly helpful.
Great. When it comes to disinformation, I think we're seeing some interesting trends during COVID. One of them is that the platform companies seem to be getting more assertive about taking down material that relates to the pandemic itself. In the past, especially in political settings, they have been understandably very reluctant to try to set themselves up in judgment about what is true and what's responsible and what should be, what kinds of speech should be allowed on their platforms. If anything, they have tended in the direction of allowing maybe a lot more than some of their critics would have wanted them to. But with respect to disinformation and misinformation about the pandemic, the difference between those being disinformation is deliberate attempt to seed false information, and misinformation is information that is wrong and perhaps dangerous, but maybe not malicious. Anyway, they've taken steps to more aggressively take down material which is putting people in danger by spreading false or dangerous information about the pandemic. And so if those companies have been more aggressive with respect to that information, it'll be interesting to see what happens as we get further into the election season, and some actors are trying to push the envelope and see how much they can get away with saying. It could be that the companies will be in a more aggressive mood in this cycle.
This is very much something that is a work in progress. I think the platforms are doing a lot of this on the fly. Just in the last 24 hours, I saw first that Google was not going to allow any information about the pandemic except from certain official sources. And then there was an outcry from people who said, what do you mean we can't talk about this? This is the most pressing issue of the day and is going to be the most pressing issue in the election. And you're telling us that we can't talk about it? And I think they are reconsidering that, according to what I was reading today. But they really are going to have to be moving very quickly, and they're going to make some mistakes along the way.
Sure. And with respect to the pandemic, I think they're trying to draw a line between what amounts to either bad medical advice or false facts about safety, as opposed to opinion about who's at fault or what the policy responses should be. But these lines can be really difficult to draw in practice.
Adding on to that, it is difficult sometimes to tell what's real and what's not. I got an email from my mother just the other day about coronavirus, and I'm like, Mom. But to put in a plug for the nonprofit that I work for now, the National Conference on Citizenship, team there has developed a tool they call Junkipedia. They're working with media outlets to report on misinformation and disinformation. And if regular everyday citizens want to add to this treasure trove of reported and tracked and verified information, I will post the email address and the phone number to text to in the chat.
Right. Certainly one of the aspects of the COVID situation that's been really encouraging is, first, all the people who are stepping up to volunteer in one way or another, using the skills and background that they have to try to make things better in one way or another. And that, of course, also brings more visibility to the people who were doing all that good work all along. And it's when those two communities team up, is you really sort of get amplification. Attendees, you can look in the chat window. Dana has posted there the information about how to report misinformation, disinformation, and so on, as well as that Trusted Info 2020 hashtag. I'd like to change the subject a little bit and talk about voter registration, another important part of the process. And some states have online voter registration and some still don't. How does the keeping people at home affect the voter registration process, as well as accessibility of the polls?
Well, I guess I can answer that one there. So we do have online voter registration aspects in Maryland, and so we're one of the fortunate states that have developed that. And it's a great system that is in place. The only drawback is it requires a driver's license. So right now, MVA, the Motor Vehicles Administration, is closed. So no one can get a new driver's license, and if you move into the state, you can't get a driver's license. So there is kind of a drawback there with some of the because we wanted to verify and get the signature from the Motor Vehicle Administration. If you don't have that one piece of information, it kind of stops the process. So, as we're trying to think of new ways to help try to solve that in this type of situation and crisis that we're facing here. And, some solutions are also limited in-person voting on a vote by mail platform there. Along the lines too with disabled voters on that, how they get their vote by mail ballot. They can, we have online ballot marking tools to help facilitate them in getting that so that they can mark their ballot with in their privacy of their own home, on their own, with their own computer. But there's some challenges with that as well. So I think there's always some, as you keep moving forward with the use of technology and voter registration, it's still not as easy as just a simple paper process where it's just you fill in the information and it goes through the normal thing, whether you put the last 4 digits of your social security or a driver's license, or you don't put any of that information in and then you have to go to the polls and supply it at that time there. But it's it's a benefit having those online applications due to this situation here, so that when people are trying to register, you can, and you don't, and it's instantaneous rather than something that is a manual process that can be delayed through mail and through other aspects of election officials just doing their day-to-day jobs.
I'd like to also, with respect to this, talk about the issues around access to the internet at all that many people do have. If you don't have, say, voter registration with somebody setting up a card table on the street corner in the center of town and collecting information, and you don't have door-to-door canvassing in neighborhoods where there may be lower levels of access to the internet, people may have difficulty being able to get online. In many places, the public library or a school or some similar institution may be the on-ramp to the internet for a lot of people, and of course, those are closed down in many places. There's a lot of effort going on to try to make internet access more broadly available through either by building out infrastructure or by companies temporarily relaxing their access rules or relaxing their billing and deadlines, and so on. But still, we're left with many people who don't have access. And if the only or main source of election information and access to registration or possibly information about how to request an absentee ballot, if that's all online, we're left with a situation where it's a lot more difficult for some would-be voters to connect to the process. Have you heard about people trying to find creative ways of dealing with this issue?
So yes, I mean, this is where kind of voter outreach is the of course, one of the toughest things out there right now. And using social media is one way, but yes, if you don't have access to the internet or anything, it's how do you get and how do you touch those specific voters? One of the things is, especially with inactive voters right now, making sure that because they're not going to get a ballot, or how do you make sure that they're having correct access? Disabled voters, how do they know that they have to request to get the ballot emailed to them on this front? These are all difficulties that we're facing, and you kind of have almost everything on the table. Between trying to do PSAs, talking with the campaigns as much as possible to help. We help them to help us to make sure on that front there, and it's different, and it's we're all just trying to get through this crisis here, and at the same time you're trying to also weed through all the other information that's being pumped out at individuals, especially TV, where it's just COVID-19 and everything else, and trying to get sure that your message is across the board there. It's a difficult situation right now. Along the lines there, I would like to put my little PSA in this little thing here. Vote by mail means that you have to have your voter registration address up to date. So it's very important that if you're watching this or going out there, or if you're in a state that's going to do that, make sure that your voter registration address is is the correct one. Because if not, you're not going to go to the polls and try to correct it and vote provisionally or do that. Your ballot is going to be mailed to that address. And so it's important that, take the time now, if you have the ability to do it, to verify your voter registration address.
And most states that have online registration also allow you to check and update your registration address online. Yes. So you can look for that service in your own state and make sure that you are registered where you should be.
Yes, and I think it's one of the things that the pandemic has shown is that we do need internet capabilities across the board, almost to the extent like back in the 40s, where it's like almost everyone had to have a telephone. These are vital services now, just to pump out information, just in order to do any of our day-to-day functions now. It's getting to the point where it was like a phone in the 40s.
I think this is one of the many lessons we're learning in this very unusual time, is the importance of access to those services. Yeah.
And I would hope that election administrators across the country are looking at things like deadlines, because some states have same-day registration, but other states you have to register a certain number of days in advance of the election. And if it is physically not possible to get the kind of either a driver's license or whatever form of ID that people might need in order to vote, if the offices are closed and you can't get that, then I would hope that election administrators are extending the deadlines to a point where that hopefully those offices are going to be open again.
Well, this assumes that you can get a court order to do it, and that the court is open so that that can be done.
Well, right, and basically, if the governors, when they, like our governor and our board, extended our deadline for the April 28th, the special general election, from it was going to be April 7th was going to be the deadline, and now it's April 21st, and we might even extend it even further at our board meeting later tonight or today.
When my team was doing work around language access, one of the things that we came to realize is how crucially important ethnic media are. Not only television, but a lot of people are watching ethnic media television who don't necessarily have access to the internet or have good cell coverage, but also like old school print newspapers that you might pick up at your supermarket or your favorite restaurant or your community center. Like that is a really effective vehicle for reaching people.
So we've had quite a few questions have come in on the Q&A channel. Those who are watching, if you're watching on Zoom, there's at the bottom of your window, you will probably see a Q&A icon, which you can click and you can enter questions there. And we've gotten a bunch in, so I'm going to ask some of these of the panelists. So we have one question from Harvey that says, what about COVID-19's effect on voter and campaign access to witness and verify, to correct discrepancies or just gain confidence in the process? For example, eligibility determination in vote by mail is done typically behind closed doors in central count facilities. Are people concerned about limitations on access to evidence about the election due to the virus? Or are measures being taken to try to increase transparency around these sorts of processes?
I guess I'll answer that one there. I think at one point here, I mean, these are the things that we're trying to look at, and whether it's live streaming, how to make sure that the canvas is done and allow campaigns and the public have access to it, which they normally would have access to come in and view under a normal situation. But because of COVID, we can't allow them, or the room won't be able to satisfy that, to look at how to do live streaming, making sure that campaigns then have the right to challenge or can go through the ballots before they're counted. You know, I don't think that they were ever behind closed doors, because the campaigns and the public always had access to it, but they never really did. And now it's kind of like a little bit of different access. It will be, you know, on our website, something to that effect. I think that we're still looking for the best way and allow campaigns the ability to have real-time access to the process.
And of course, this is all going to vary state by state. Yeah. But I know one concern that I've heard voiced is, particularly with more vote by mail, that's going to rely on signature verification. You're going to have poll workers who are going to be checking the signatures, and to the extent that people's ballots are being put aside because someone determines that the signatures don't match, voters need to have the right to challenge that. And to say, no, I just sort of scrolled my signature sloppily that day. That really is me. But they have to be informed if their ballot's going to be put aside.
And so one of the challenges, and this goes to one of the questions, is from Joe, that there's many jurisdictions normally have only a small number of vote by mail ballots, and so the processes they use may not be scalable. Or the security and verification issues may be less significant when there are relatively few ballots involved. If you need to take those processes and scale them up so that, say, all ballots in a jurisdiction are coming in by mail and going through that very different verification and tabulation process, what is advice for officials in localities that have to do that? Both direct advice, what should they do, but also maybe where they might go for information, help, and best practices.
Well, one of the best places to get information about vote at home, vote by mail, is the National Vote at Home Institute. That team has been working with election officials and vendors and the Postal Service for a while on making voting by mail, voting at home, as accessible as possible. Amber McReynolds, who's the CEO of Vote at Home, also was an election official in Colorado for many years.
Yes.
And is really familiar with the custody issues and the security issues on the back end, as it were, in the election office, and I'm pretty sure there's guidance around that there.
And people are going to have to be patient, because it is quite possible, if we have a predominantly vote by mail election, that we're not going to know on election night who won.
Yes, that was
just take a while to count all those ballots.
And no exit polls, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think,
Right.
I mean, at one point, it's just taking your absentee ballot program that you already have and kind of ramping it up for a full-scale operations. And right, vote at home and Amber are great resources, and they've been working with local, states all throughout the land here. And also, there's other states too that already have it in place, like Washington and Oregon, where we've been tapping and seeing how they've been handling this. How they've done it in the past for vote by mail programs as well. It's a small knit community.
You can't just do more of what you always had done, because the scale does change what your procedures are. In Michigan, when no excuse vote by mail went into effect, on average, requests for vote by mail went up 70%. And so some of what we're talking about is not only processing ballots, but processing requests for ballots, because you're not going to be sent a ballot directly at home by default. You're going to have to still ask for it. And so this is a burden for the voter, but it is also a burden for the administrator, because you're handling two piles of paper that you have to process and keep secure.
So I just, Maryland, we're a little bit different on that front there. We're not making them do the requests. So vote by mail, you don't have to do the request.
Use your heart.
Right. You're going to get it. And I think that it cuts down on paper, and it cuts down on problems on that front. But you have to just almost say, if you're going to do a vote by mail program, to say, this is the primary way of voting. There is no more requests. You're going to get the ballot in the mail at this address that's already in our system.
That would be amazing if we could do that uniformly, but I'm not seeing that.
Right.
This is one aspect of American election administration that people in the field understand very well, but those who are new to it often don't catch on to the significance of so quickly, and that is how decentralized our election administration is, and how the degree to which the laws and procedures vary from place to place. This is federalism at work, but it does mean that when we have a complex challenge, that it needs to be addressed in literally a few thousand places, and that makes it all the more important for people to share information about best practices, and those who have dealt with the challenge in the past, making sure that those who are encountering it for the first time can learn from them. We will probably have different procedures in different places. Some places will probably go to everyone vote by mail. Some places, of course, some states in the US already do that, but we will probably have some places going to vote by mail only, some places adopting no excuses absentee ballot where they didn't have it before. And in any case, probably a lot more people voting remotely as in this election. We do have, though, at least one attendee asking the contrarian question that says, given the challenges around vote by mail and the fact that people still are able to go to the supermarket and the pharmacy and so on while practicing social distancing, should we consider trying to enable in-person voting, but change the processes and the logistics and the layout of the polling place in a way that lets people maintain that distance and tries to reduce the likelihood of disease transmission? Is that a direction that we might consider?
Well, I think that in-person voting, even in a vote by mail state, has necessary functions for same-day voter registration, aspects that for if you need to vote and you're a disabled voter and you want to use a ballot, the machines that are designed to be for the disability Americans with Disabilities Act compliant. So there is a little bit of a balancing act there with it for in-person voting. And the problem becomes physical buildings that you're asking for here. There's only so much room in a place that you're taking over. You know, it has to meet all other requirements as well, such as, you know, making sure that it might be near public transportation, or if there's ample parking, handicap accessible, so that you can get into these buildings here. But yes, if we do have it, these are things that we are looking at, you know, possibly using technology and other ways. In some of our discussions, there was the idea, or at least some proposals, of like appointment making for voting, and kind of having like a queue so that people can like have a virtual line. They come in, they give their name and number, and then socially, you know, distance themselves from the area, and then, you know, come in when their turn is up in the virtual queue and stuff. So there's I would say, these are all the things that are being discussed and being looked at, because we are in a pandemic here in uncharted territories, and looking at making sure that almost every option is available, while at the same time making sure that we weigh the health risks here, manning those polls, having people come in there. There is lack of resources for just doctors, let alone, you know, having them then for the election judges. And once again, I mentioned that earlier, which is one of the problems, is that election judges historically are of 60-year-olds and above. So, you know, these are kind of, you know, you have to man them, and these are the challenges that we all face here, you know, trying to balance out as much as possible on this.
I think we have to figure out how to do it all.
Right.
I have not heard too many people suggest that we should go exclusively to vote by mail. There are some communities where that really wouldn't work. Tribal lands in particular don't have postal addresses, that they don't have the kind of mail system that would lend itself to a vote by mail system, and we want to make sure that we're not disenfranchising anyone. So the proposals that I've heard go to, yes, expanded vote by mail, which I personally I'm a big adherent of, but also expanded early voting period, sort of stretch out the amount of time that people will have to vote. So, you know, everything from putting down painter's tape on the floors to say, okay, you stand here, and then here's the next person is going to stand 6 feet away. We're going to have to be really creative about this to make sure that we can have a safe election. Some people feel safe going to the grocery store, and some people are ordering their groceries delivered. And we have to make sure that people are able to exercise their right to vote in a way that is safe and feels safe to them, and that people are not disenfranchised by the process.
Also, not to put too fine a point on it, but all vote by mail states like Washington and Oregon have always had in-person voting available for their entire history. So it is not as if no one is voting in person in those places. And so I don't think anybody is, at least none of the election officials who I have spoken with, that we would only be exclusively vote by mail, that it's always going to have to be some opportunity, some way of voting in person.
So one thing that many people say about this pandemic situation is that this is a giant storm wave that will wash over us, and we'll emerge on the other side of it in some condition. And then things will look different after this has happened than they looked before. And that policies and practices in some areas may change, perhaps significantly, partly because of things we learned during the experience, and partly because of how we see the world perhaps differently after having had this experience together. I want to, in the few remaining minutes, just invite you to speculate about what kinds of changes might happen. What are changes that maybe have been a long time coming and have been needed that may be more likely to happen, and what are changes that you think may be driven by the experience we have here? And naturally, this is entirely speculative, so we understand that, as I said to Dana before, it's kind of an unfair question, but I also think it is a useful conversation to start having. So let me open the floor to the panelists on that question.
I'm excited about this question, as you can tell. I think a huge one is going to be about transparency. Even though there was access for the public to processes for watching the polls or for watching recounts and other processes that happen in the election office. And while many larger jurisdictions have already put up cameras so their processes and procedures are observable either through live streams or on public access television or both, I think there will be much more demand for more transparency at every level that elections are done. And we saw this to some extent in the Iowa caucus, even though those elections are not run by government election officials, but by parties. There were some things that happened there that nobody had paid attention to before that now they had insight to. And I think we're going to see some of that and a call for more openness and more transparency in this and after this.
And I hope that that drive for more transparency will also extend to campaign finance, where there are some proposals that really have been bottled up. For example, the proposal to extend the rules on broadcast advertising to the internet. I think we really need to bring digital advertising under the same legal framework that broadcast is under, and get better information to people about where the information is coming from that they're seeing online. So I'm hoping that this will be a push for this, as well as you mentioned earlier, for expanding people's access to the internet, which I think we are newly discovering is vital not only for voting and for getting voting information, but there are kids who are trying to participate in their classes, and if they don't have access to the internet, they're blocked out of their education. It could spur healthcare reform. It could spur all sorts of interesting policy changes, and some of them I think would be really for the good. Maybe it takes an emergency sometimes to really focus people's attention on some of these needs.
One thing we will likely have seen is an election where much more of the discourse is online. We've already seen a shift of much of it to online, and very significant, and online forums playing a very significant role. But this really could be an election cycle in which, during the critical time, almost all political communication is conducted at a distance.
It was already predicted before all of this happened that we were going to see almost $3 billion in political advertising on digital platforms and in digital media. So this is only going to increase those numbers.
So what would constitute a valuable transparency regime for campaign finance and especially campaign communication in today's world? You mentioned, Ellen, extending the rules for broadcast to the internet, and those are things like disclosing the source of funding for communications and so on. Are there additional issues that come up specifically in the online world that we might discuss trying to address?
Well, I think this is not something that is specific to the online world, but perhaps is exacerbated by it when you're looking at these quick ads that are posted online, and you see these disclaimers, hopefully. And that's a debate that we've been having at the FEC as to what kind of disclaimers we need to have on digital advertising. But even when you get the disclaimers, often it will tell you that the ad is sponsored by, Americans for Apple Pie, and nobody knows who's behind Americans for Apple Pie. So I would like to see greater disclosure of the real source of the money, the donors who are behind the information that we're seeing, and also addressing the funneling of money through shell corporations, which we have sometimes seen masks not only the identity of the donors of people who just don't want, for whatever reason, their names exposed, but sometimes the reason they don't want their names exposed is because they are not legally able to donate. I mean, we have seen money coming in from foreign sources through domestic subsidiaries of overseas corporations, and I really think that this could be an opportunity once we get through all this to take another hard look at some of the ways that dark money has been preventing citizens from getting the information that they need to fairly evaluate the sources of the information that they're seeing.
And I'd like to just also add to that with the idea of bots in this realm as well here, because bots are being used to help disseminate this information on a massive viral scale here, and that people, especially now that are getting all their information off of social media, are not knowing that this is a, you know, an AI situation here, and they're thinking that this is a real person. So disclosure of bots and that they are being used to disseminate campaign information is vital as well, to make sure that the citizens know that who is talking to them and how the information is getting to there. I just want to make one little note here. It seems that there's something going on that I said that the June 2nd election may be delayed in my board meeting. That is not true. I don't know if I said that or not. I don't believe I did. So I just wanted to just make sure that that the idea that the election, the June 2nd election, is not going to be delayed, you know, at all. So just wanted to make sure that that's out there.
I wanted to echo Jared's point on the bots. Robots do not have First Amendment rights.
Right.
So I don't think that, you know, we really need to allow them to be engaging in political speech without people knowing at a minimum that they are there. But in addition, you know, we have an increasing problem with altered media. And right now it's not that sophisticated. These deep fakes, you know, we're seeing more cheap fakes than deep fakes, but it is going to get more sophisticated. And I think that it is incumbent, again, upon lawmakers to adopt laws so that people would know when they're seeing altered media. And at a minimum, we could have some kind of disclosure of that, because again, when we're talking about disclosure, the Supreme Court's been very firm on the value of disclosure and has been robust in its support of it. So that really shouldn't be a problem under First Amendment law, to get better information so that people will just know how genuine the information is that they're getting.
We are nearly out of time. Any final words from the panelists?
I would like to thank all of the people who work in election administration every day, who are working really hard to ensure that every person who is eligible gets registered, stays registered, and gets a ballot that they can mark and cast. It is an incredibly complex job, and I thank you all for doing that, especially you, Jared, for being in this panel today when there's so many other things to do.
And I would just like to, in addition to thanking the election administrators, I'd like to put out a pitch to the voters. We really, in this year, when it's going to be hard, we really need everyone to step up and do their civic duty and participate in this election so that the results are representative of the will of the people. And so, you know, get your friends out to vote, get your enemies out to vote. Everybody should do what they can to vote and be represented and make their voice heard.
And I'd like to just close by thanking our three panelists. I spoke before about all the people who are admirably rallying to this cause now. But additionally, how much we appreciate those who have been fighting these battles all along. And you three are great examples of that. Thank you for what you've been doing, and thank you for your participation today. We're all smarter because you've given us this time. Thanks to you, and thanks to everyone who listened.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It was a great panel. Thank you.
Bye.